Hello and welcome to our second video at Psychomac, understanding the Milgram Experiment and why ordinary people obey. Before we get into the experiment itself, what would you do if a person of authority told you to harm another person? For instance, your friend or an unknown person. No, right? Like, why would we ever harm anyone else? This is simple. Well, it isn't. Now, hypothetically, but under pressure, in a structured setting, with step-by-step instructions, forcing you to do so, it won't be such an easy choice. To the experiment, in the early 60s, there was a psychologist named Milgram, and he conducted a study that would become one of the most controversial and influential experiments in psychology, especially in behaviorism, the Milgram Obedience Experiment. It's worth mentioning that even though that it's a very specific behavioral experiment, an early one as well, there's a movie about it, more than 2 hours long. Take that aside. Today, we'll break down how the experiment worked, what it found, why it shocked the world, and what teaches us about the human behavior and authority. Well, first of all, we need to talk about the historical context and purpose. Why was the experiment conducted? Where did Milgram get this idea to conduct the whole thing? Well, to deeply fathom why the experiment was conducted, we'll have to look at the aftermath of World War II, specifically the answers of Nazi soldiers to the question why they were behaving the way they were towards Jews, towards the people they were fighting against, and everyone in the war. During the Holocaust, millions of people died, and after the Holocaust and the war, mostly at the Nuremberg trials, many Nazi officials defended themselves by stating that they were only following orders that were given to them. Hence, they were behaving so harshly. Now, this disturbed many people, but especially it stood out to Milgram, because how could ordinary people carry out cruel actions without hesitation simply because they were told to? He wanted to understand something specific. Were Nazi soldiers fundamentally different from anyone else? Or could average people, random, everyday individuals, under the right authority and pressure, behave the same way? Is obedience to authority so powerful that it can override a person's individual judgment and moral values? At Yale University in 1961, Milgram began recruiting men who are aged roughly between 20 and 50 to take part in what they believed was a study on memory and learning. Basically, there was a false advertisement that gave these targeted but random people the ability to and the chance to go partake in a very harmless experiment, according to the paper, and get $4 per hour for participation. Now, here's how the classic experiment itself was underwent structured. While each volunteer was introduced to two other people: an experimenter, the authority figure, and a learner, but only the learner was Confederate, an actor helping Milgram, of course. The participant was always assigned the role of teacher. The Confederate became the learner, and the participant was told to administer increasingly strong electric shocks, and for every wrong answer the learner gave on a memory test. The learner, of course, was strapped into a chair in another room, and a shock generator with 30 labeled voltage switches from light shock to danger, severe shock, stood before the teacher. The shocks were fake, but the participants believed they were real. Also, the reactions were faked as well, so this were value to believe. Each time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was instructed to deliver a shock and increase the voltage. The teacher's responses were pre-programmed, from grunts to screams to eventual silence, implying death, creating the impression of increasing distress. When the participant hesitated to turn up the voltage of the shocks, there were multiple lines pre-programmed for that reaction. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Now that we've kind of attained an understanding of how the experiment was structured and delivered, we have to look at the results, the most important thing in all experiments. Milgram first published these findings in 1963, 2 years later after the first recruitment of the members, in his paper Behavioral Study of Obedience. Contrary to what Milgram and most psychologists predicted, that only a few people would obey completely, the results were surprisingly wrong. Out of 40 participants, in the standard condition of course, 26 people, which is equivalent to around 65%, continued to deliver shocks up to the maximum 450 volts. Now, conclusion of the results doesn't need much expertise in psychology or in the behavioral sphere, but the results clearly showed how willing most people were to undergo to such measures and harm other people just because they were under pressure and forced to do it. So, one more disturbing part of the experiment and its results was the observation Milgram had on the participants. Many were sweating, trembling, stuttering, they were laughing nervously, and there were even some cases of seizures. Yet, many still continued obeying the orders. So, why do people obey? Milgram theorized that several psychological and situational factors made obedience more likely, which are the following four. Legitimacy of authority. Because the study took place at Yale University and was led by someone in the lab coat, participants perceived the authority was credible. Second, step-by-step escalation. Participants increased shock levels gradually, a slippery slope that made it psychologically harder to refuse and say no. Third, perceived obligation. Many participants felt the obligation to partake and listen to the rules they were given just because they accepted to be a part of the experiment. Factor is pressure and the diffusion of responsibility. Now, because the actual participants and lab rats of the experiment were the teachers, they had another person in a lab coat, which was perceived as more of a strong authority person and who had more power and more responsibility. Therefore, it was a lighter burden for the teacher to take actions, so all the weight of the decision wouldn't lay on the teacher's shoulders. Now, we talked about the classical experiment, the initial one, but we didn't mention the later versions Milgram conducted as well. He didn't stop at one design. We ran multiple variations to see how change was applied and how change affected obedience. Obedience dropped when the teachers could choose the shock voltages by themselves or where the learner was in the room. These variations of the experiments later conducted show that authority and social context, not just obedience itself, drive behavior. PubMed article tracing the experiment's origins show how Milgram refined his design through pilot studies until he found a setup that consistently revealed high obedience rates, contrary to expectations. As the technical elements of the experience are out of the way, let's talk about the ethical controversies, which were also present in my last video of the Little Albert experiment. I recommend you watch it. Participants were deceived about the true purpose of the study and believed they were causing real harm. Even though Milgram helped to debriefy most of the subjects after the experiments, most of them were still left by some psychological distress and the burden that they actually hurt or damaged someone. As a result, the Milgram experiment became a catalyst for stricter ethical standards in psychological research, pushing modern boards to enforce informed consent, participants' protection, and debriefing procedures. Making a parallel to little Albert's experiment, the main problem there was that the experiment was conducted on a infant child and there was no debriefing done. So there are a lot of controversies and ideas where little Albert went after the experiment, but it's to this day it's cannot be said by 100% confidence if he ever healed from the psychological damage he was dealt with, or if he even survived. Now, why is this experiment relevant to us and to people who are not interested in studying psychology or going through the whole branch of behaviorism? Well, it shows that bad decisions and bad actions are not only done by a few bad apples, so bad personnel. It's just that obedience comes into play so much that people are forced to do things they would never do on their own and they could never comprehend of doing willingly. It doesn't prove that humans are inherently evil. It shows that authority and social context can shape human behavior in powerful ways, sometimes overriding personal values, moral perspectives, and opinions. So my suggestion would be the next time you hear someone make orders in a social context around you, ask yourself, why obey? Why should I listen? Am I doing the right thing, listening to them? Or should I go against the grain? Thank you guys as always for watching and tuning in. I have to inform you that this will probably be my last video on this channel. I know you guys love it so much, but maybe in the future we'll cover some of other important experiments, and see ya.